Well, welcome again, everyone, to Bookish and Based, the podcast from the National Conservative Institute of Australia. I'm here with Jordan Knight, still in the UK, and enjoying himself over there during the English summer. Jordan, we had a bit of a win, our first scalp here in Australia this week, or at least one you can claim, right? Because the Immigration and Home Affairs Minister have both been demoted. It's something you've been on about for a while.
Yeah, that's correct. The Jordan Knight Network sends its regards on those two scalps. No, look, it's we were calling for them to resign. I think like early last year with Migration Watch, because they're incompetent and created a once in a generation housing crisis. Not to mention all sorts of other social cohesion issues and stuff like that. But also B, because Andrew Giles is just like an unashamed far leftist. Like, he celebrates Ramadan but doesn't celebrate Australia Day, and I'm not sure if having somebody like that in charge of our borders is necessarily the smartest thing. So yeah, we've been sort of trying to plant the seeds, at least in the public domain, of them getting fired, and then the Liberal Party sort of took up that mantle as well. But they didn't get fired, unfortunately. Yeah,
it was good because we wrote a formal letter to the guy. The letter was to Giles, right? It wasn't to Claire O'Neill.
That's right. Yeah, that was January this year, and I think that that went like semi sort of viral, and I think put the pressure on a bit, which was good. I mean, it's extremely hard to quantify actually how much effect you're having on things. I mean, you can say nothing, or you can say it's having a bit, but who really knows? But yeah.
But with the Media Watch, when they went after you, that was not long after the letter, was it? Or that was a month or two after that letter?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, a couple of months after that, so Giles probably called his mate Paul Barry and said, "Kill him" or something. No, just kidding. But things did really pick up then, and then like when the Liberal parties announced that they were going to run on immigration as well, I think that sort of started putting a spotlight on things. But
I mean, it may be too early to break out the champagne, because I sent you a recent article from the Oz. Tony Burke is he's the new minister for everything, really. He was formerly an immigration minister with not the greatest record on legals, and not the greatest on, actually, he wasn't great on migration, legal migration either, right? Because it was during the Kevin Rudd period when they also ramped it up quite a bit. And people forget, I always think immigration has been an issue which has determined elections going way back, because Kevin Rudd was riding high in the polls, and then he started to talk about Big Australia, and it was then that his polls went down. And they thought people were saying, oh, it's to do with him being rude to people at some youth parliament or whatever. But it was actually when he started rabbiting on about that he really started to tank. So anyway, there you go. But
that's very interesting.
But just after, I just noticed just before we were on that the Business Council of Australia and the G8, which is a university block for the elite unis, are calling for a rethinking of the caps on student visas, and so they never sleep, right?
These people are just absolutely shameless, right? There was about a 2-month window where there was almost talk of there being caps on international students, and they went into the biggest meltdown you've ever seen. And now that there's a new guy in, Tony Burke, they've immediately started lobbying him to end even the thought of caps. So they haven't even started yet properly, and already they're lobbying against it. It's absolutely shameless. Like ACCI, the Australian Chamber of Commerce, BCA, and the GOA. I mean, it's just absolutely oligarchic. These are like these represent some of the biggest companies and universities in Australia, completely acting against the interest of the welfare and living standards of Australians. It's absolutely shameless. And what's needed is a political force or somebody to stand up to these people with any legitimacy and say, well, actually, you're beholden to Australian interests, not just profiteering interests, right? But
it's just so clear to me that they clearly view growth as coming from immigration. It's not like we're designing better products and services, or even it just makes it very apparent where they consider the true growth of what growth is reliant on in those industries, right? It's just like, give us our cocaine. their immigration.
No,
So
that's so true. There used to be a bit of a sort of gray area of like, immigration in a long sort of method sort of equates to, a better economy. Now they're just straight up saying, well, we need immigrants just to keep inflating our coffers and the GDP and stuff like that. Like it's just so shameless and upfront that they would just straight up say we need the continuation of mass immigration. And it's desperate too. I mean, the fact that they're still doing it and so blatantly says to me they either have stopped caring about how they appear, or they're just desperate for more. It's oligarchic, and people need to take the fight to them, I think.
yeah, and I just anyway, it's I was reading. There was an article just came online from Alexander Dana, and he was like so many in the Oz, just not quite getting US politics, I think. But he was talking about immigration. What he wants in a president, and he wants a president who doesn't believe in tariffs and wants to back Ukraine to the hilt. But he wants a president who embraces immigration. I wouldn't want a president who thought immigration could be uncontrolled. Okay, who let people smugglers in, but immigration, they want to get back to the there's no family values don't stop at the Rio Grande. Immigration is an act of love type of the Bush type era stuff, and it's just I don't know. It just amazes me how people can be so stuck in a sort of different era in a way. They just can't adjust it to what time it is at the moment. But speaking of which, man, you're still in the UK, and I am curious because last time we spoke, you were talking about Speaker's Corner, which was I found quite fascinating. What else have you noticed about the UK? What are they? Which areas do you think they're further down, closer to the waterfall than us, and which areas are they not? I mean.
Well, I were to look, I think financially they're probably in worse, more precarious area than Australia. Australia is still relatively wealthy, although how much of that is just kind of just a bubble is yet to be seen. In ways that they're worse, like a Brit sort of involved in the political scene over here said, go visit this area, you'll see how bad the demographic change has gotten, and you'll see how bad sort of the cultural change has gotten. Like you go there and you think you're not in Britain anymore. And I kind of went there and I was like, this is nothing. Like there are parts of Sydney that are actually far worse than this, right? And
which part of London was that?
Somebody said to go to, I think it was Whitechapel, I'm pretty sure. And there is like a sort of, there is an element of it that is a bit, there's a lot of social housing, public housing there. That doesn't seem like the area seems to be terribly economically active. But compared to places that I've seen in the west of Sydney that I've gone and visited, the places I've seen in Sydney, to my mind, seemed worse. Worse in terms of just like the rate of cultural change, the sheer amount. I mean, there's places in Western Sydney that aren't multicultural, that aren't diverse. They are very, they're largely one culture and one group of people, and it's not multicultural at all. Yeah.
Where are you thinking? Because back in the day, I mean, I remember when I was studying Chinese back in the day, I ended up going to Cabramatta. Cabramatta at one stage had a reputation for being, very Vietnamese. It still is, in the same way that Sunnybank in Brisbane, these places are very Chinese. But it still wasn't, there was still there were a lot of Vietnamese shops, but it was still Australian in feel, really. It wasn't like you were visiting a complete. Wasn't going into Chinatown, and even Chinatown in Australia aren't completely all Chinese. It tends to be like pawn shops and all sorts of other bric-a-brac type of outfits as well.
Yeah, well, I don't know if it's just me, but when I went to Cabramatta, it didn't have that Australian feel. It felt it had like a sort of it had Australian buildings, but everything else was essential, and it had like the Australian blue sky, but that's about it. Right? Like everything, it was quite literally. It seemed close to 95% Vietnamese, but I mean that's not just Cabramatta. If you go to Harris Park now, Harris Park is seems to be at least the dominant culture, and by appearance, it seems like a largely sort of Indian population. You go to Burwood, it seems to. So, people talk about multiculturalism and the changing sort of diverse Sydney. Well, it's actually just seems to be a sort of balkanized city of different enclaves of different people. And like, okay, maybe the idea of diversity and multiculturalism is beautiful, but it's not what's happening. What's happening is that there are sort of certain dividing lines breaking up these areas. And you have to
Mm.
say, is this actually a good thing? Like, I can't, maybe there's an argument that it's not the worst thing in the world, right? Maybe it works fine, but is it helping? Like, it's a policy decision. Is it a
Yeah,
benefit?
yeah.
It's, yeah, I don't
But
know.
there wouldn't be.
Yeah.
I imagine there wouldn't be a because of the way the immigration sort of happened in Britain earlier in the 50s compared to us, and where they came from. Like there's much more Caribbean and West African and then Indian influence in the UK. Like there isn't a Cabramatta type area. There's less Chinese overall in the UK than there are in Australia, or Vietnamese there in Australia. So you don't get I can't think of a Cabra, not that I know the UK super well, but I can't think of a Cabramatta type place. But there's certainly like lots of little places that are very, Indian subcontinent now in the UK, just with different weather.
Interestingly as well, another thing that's sort of, you're talking before about what's going on and whereas Britain sort of more advanced, so to speak. Just recently, I'm not sure if you saw, but there was a big scandal over here about a policeman that was kicking
I saw that.
A Pakistani guy while he was down. Well, just recently the footage was revealed that they started hitting the police first, and including a police women as well. Well, I think the interesting thing that stood out to me from that was that there were very public figures, political and media figures, who immediately came out on the side of police. And I think that says to me that there's a massive sort of, that wouldn't have happened a couple of years ago. Everybody would have immediately defaulted to being on the side of the guy getting kicked. But the fact that they're now sort of saying, well, we know for a fact, we can 99% guess that there is a bigger picture here. There's a bigger story here. And it turns out that was true, but it was shown by other footage. It says to me that in Britain there is an appetite for a return to order. There is this. I don't know if things are sort of trending back in the right direction fully, but I feel like people are sort of getting sick of, having the feeling that their country is being taken advantage of, and their niceness is being taken advantage of. Their police are getting attacked, right? Like I think they're getting pretty sick of that. And politicians are sort of coming out pretty strongly on that. Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes those Europeans can be, despite being really, weak on borders and weak on other things, they can be kind of, the mainland Europeans can be quite parochial and self-interested when they want to be.
That's right. Yeah, that's very true.
But then you go, yeah, anyway, but it often doesn't seem to last that. And I don't know, have we had the same, what's the last high profile kind of, we haven't had a Rodney King style situation in Australia. Have we had anything like that? I can't readily recall like a video that's
no,
police
not really.
No BLM type of. Well, I guess there was the Fuller guy in the detention center in the Northern Territory, which became a bit of a cause célèbre for a while, but that wasn't quite the same.
Yeah, I don't think the lines are so drawn in Australia yet as they are in Britain. In Britain, it really does feel like a sort of in-group versus an out-group sort of thing that's developing. Because in Leeds, just a couple of weeks ago, up in the north, there was a similar sort of scenario. Police came and I think took some children away from like a traveller community or something like that.
I saw that. Yeah.
And then there was massive riots for nights after that.
Was it Bangladesh or was it? It was hard to work out.
I'm not too sure. Yeah, but that's the thing. It kind of just turned into this like us versus them mentality, where it's like we are angry at the state / the racist white cops, and it's not a healthy position to be in if it's if that's where your society is devolving into, where people see the British state and the British native population of England as one sort of aggressive racist group. And the other side sees themselves as this collective force against it. And I think, it looks to be like a similar sort of scenario unfolding in these pro-Palestine marches every week. It's devolving into not this nuanced, like, we have a separate interests, and we're just sort of advocating for the things that we want in a group effort. It's like, no, it's turning into this us versus them, and them being the Australian state, the Australian people. It seems to be sort of devolving rapidly into this enemy friend distinction.
The UK always amuses me because they always have these very highbrow Oxbridge style debates about in one section of town, and then it's divorced from, it seems like, the reality of what goes on in amongst the less articulate types, right? But nevertheless, they're the ones who are actually changing the reality of what's on the ground. But you can go. You said you went to the Cotswolds as a day trip. If you go out there, it's lily white England of old.
Right? Oh yeah, I've been in the bubbles of bubbles, right? Like, it is if you like where I've been staying, you'd think, and I really do sympathize with the elites, right? Like, I've been staying in like touristy areas and stuff like that. And if you spend time here, you would think that the world's fine. Multiculturalism works. You think that immigration is fine, like the nice young waiter, whatever. Like, and you've got money because you live in these areas. The world's hunky dory. But if you spend any time outside of that bubble, it's the grimmest place on earth, and you're calling for a revolution, right? It's like, I think this is a problem that I don't know how to solve, about how to get elites on side, right?
Well, the wealthy can insulate themselves, and the people of a different generation have a very rose-eyed view of it. Like, I remember reading something Tony Abbott wrote about, and he has a bit of touch. He's not the worst guy in terms of looseness with reality, but they're a little bit kind of formed by their time at Oxford, where they were playing cricket with Imran, and there was Benazir, and good old Jimmy Wong was studying hard in his room, and that's sort of how they see the world. Everyone's good-natured chums, but they're dealing with a very kind of elite, and everyone, the elite of all nations, can be all very agreeable and interesting, but the reason why there are nations is to sort of not deal with, but because the whole ballast of a particular culture needs to live somewhere, and they're not always they have their own interests, which are very different to the kind of international globalized class. But I do see it's almost comic sometimes how divorced that international sort of global deracinated types are from the reality on the ground. But so anyway, so on we go. I mean, we had some wins in Australia. I can't, when we almost have to devote a section to I think to op-eds in the Australian that are just completely
That's true. Yeah, we should critique one every single day.
Well, that's right, because it really has been the last week in particular. Greg Sherder and Paul Kelly again. And the one from Alexander Dunner, which I was just half reading from before, is kind of interesting because, he is the longest serving foreign minister of Australia. And they're articulate and nice, the Downers, and they I'm sure I agree with them on 90% of other things than not. But this particular article was just almost like the antithesis of NACON. It was he just wants to go back to, Trump's bad because he talks about tariffs, and Trump's bad because he talks about reducing immigration, and Trump's bad because he doesn't want to get involved in choose your international conflict, and Harris is bad because she's whatever divisive and identity politics. And what do you think about identity? That term identity politics. What do you understand by that? What do you think of?
Well, I don't know. I guess I focus more on the economic side because it's more, I think, prescient. But when your living standards crumble, when your wages are stagnant, when you can't afford a home, and you don't feel like your stake in the country is going anywhere, that's when you start thinking about identity, right? And it's when you're like, okay, well, if we're going to devolve into a tribal mess, who is my tribe, right? Like, who's my group? And I think Australia is sort of getting into that position, and we'll get into that position economically. And look, I mean, we're on the one hand, lots of Australians are told, don't engage in identity politics, while the left relentlessly does and uses it against people. And so if you just, it's logical that the right will inevitably just start doing the same thing that the left does and start playing by their rules. What do I think? I don't know yet. I mean, what about you?
Well, I think like I always sort of feel a little bit. I don't like obviously people overly identifying as a particular gender, race, or creed aggressively, but I always feel a bit wary when people say they're against on our side notionally against identity politics, because identity is important, right? You need to have an identity. And you can't position yourself as just being like the neutral arbiter who doesn't have is valueless, because you're not valueless. It's insincere, and you're trying to squash anyone else who might have a different identity. The problem is that there are too many competing identities really in the same zone, and there really should be. And there's been a vacuum created where the national identity traditionally was. I mean, identity politics wasn't an issue when there was a much more of a common shared culture. Now that there's a competition between different groups as to who's the more victimized or who, in terms of whatever race, gender, or class, and suddenly it's the system's in flux and everyone needs to fight as to over the spoils. So yeah, anyway, that's my take. It's just used so much, and I kind of don't quite know what to fully make of it, or whether.
I think like it depends on, like, there's two ways of looking at it. I think at a sort of political reality aspect, I don't think at the moment in Australia you can go out on an identity ticket. I don't think you should. I think there's you can do things that will be beneficial for the nation's identity, and I think that's probably a unifying force. But I don't think politically it's terribly salient to start sort of pandering to people's identity. I think those are a lot of accusations that were sort of thrown at Trump, and similarly sort of JD Vance as well.
Yep.
That they were sort of playing the identity, but I don't think that's true. I think actually they were just sort of, what they were doing was saying, well, actually this group have been overlooked. And it's not necessarily like on a racial basis. It's like the working class forgotten Americans, right? Have been overlooked, and this group needs to sort of be thought of again, and their interests thought of as again. They call it identity politics. I just think it's smart economic politics more than anything.
Well, Kamala is definitely, some of the ads I've seen is definitely promoting herself on the basis of the fact that, in fact, I saw a brief ad before which said we had the first black president and they didn't like him, and we had the first woman candidate president and they didn't like him, and now the Republicans really going to hate me, black woman candidate. I mean, it's like there's no argument there. There's no like policy. It's simply, it's pure this category and this category.
No, that's right. I was having a similar conversation with some sort of American and English people here in Britain, and they're saying, because at the same time that Joe Biden was stepping down, like, okay, it's going to be Kamala who should be the VP, stuff like that, and they're just sort of listing about like the different groups that they could like attract, because Pete Buttigieg is like a gay man, so he can attract the the gay crowd. A white guy, so he can attract it's like, okay, how about fixing, like, how about the issues, right? How about immigration? Like, how about, instead of focusing on like you say, your different elements of identity.
We don't have that yet in Australia. I mean, again, it's always worth sort of doing a check. We don't. I guess we have they typically like to have the Tony Abbott had Julie Bishop by his side consistently, as the female. I mean, and Julia Gillard had, I guess, male and other advisors. There's certainly a lot of playing the woman card in the high echelons. I'm not actually sure how effective that is, whether they actually gain more votes with women than they would in the people, whether there are additional women who would vote for them that wouldn't have voted for them otherwise. I think that's, from the data I've seen, it's not clear. It's assumed.
It seems like, yeah. It's dumb politics, I think. It doesn't get to the issue. Yeah.
No. I mean, you couldn't design a candidate less likely to attract, in theory at least, according to the, Crosby Textor, less touchy-feely than a Donald Trump, or even a Boris Johnson, because they're all a bit wild. But people don't care. Like, the people, honestly, I still believe people still believe, they're like, which of these guys is going to do something, or girls is going to make my life better? What are their actual, like, what are they doing for me? Every election is that. It's not like, oh, he looks nothing, or he looks less. The ones who are attracted by those types of claims tend to be, reasonably affluent anyway, or else hyper, there are particular ethnic groups that will vote for a particular ethnic group, but that's not, you won't get that across the whole nation either. So anyway, we shall see. So you're back in Australia, what, next week?
This week, actually. This week. So back in Australia, and going to try and take a lot of the learnings and conversations that I've had here back home, because there's interesting things happening in America and interesting things happening in Britain, and it's about trying to sort of kickstart something. Like we were talking before about, and we've spoken a lot about how the think tank scene, the right wing think tank scene, in Australia has no sort of national focus whatsoever. They're still stuck on free trade agreements and open borders for all sort of thing, right? But I mean, is that your view on things as well? Because you've had some work and some dealings with other think tanks and stuff.
It definitely is. Look, you can see it, and I think we mentioned last time, you occasionally get a little bits of shards of light. ScoMo saying that he agreed that it was sensible for the US to impose tariffs on China. You occasionally get, like, people. I mean, John Roscombe, who's from the IPA, had an article in the Fin the other day, and they're all pro-Trump, or they're kind of making excuses for Trump for why you should vote for him. But they're sort of doing it begrudgingly. They're saying, look, he won't be as bad as you think on trade. He won't be as bad as you think on foreign trade, and he'll stand up he'll be strong. But they're not actually fully. And obviously, John in his article didn't mention immigration at all. Like, it was just revealing. And so they haven't, with rare exceptions. And I struggle to think of them, but they haven't actually cottoned on to the true kind of change in the political program that's certainly come out of the US, and certainly exists in the UK with the new right types there, and they and the penny will drop eventually, and I think it just needs a proper framework so that the anger against the ridiculous policies that exist has a place to be channeled, and has a more coherent, not to be all artsy-fartsy, but coherent philosophical framework to justify it. Like, it's not a stupid reaction. You're not being nativist or xenophobic. Immigration. You have a thoughtful reason why these open border type of policies do not work for the nation, do not work for unsustainable economically, and why trade agreements doesn't make sense to have 100% of manufactured goods coming from China duty free. I mean, that's unsustainable policy. Hey, Matt, I actually have to fly, unfortunately, to cut it a bit short, but we'll check in and have a more comprehensive conversation when you're back in Oz, and we'll go from there.
Yeah. Sounds great. Cheers, Sam. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, bye.